And I believe we can get it right, and that way you end up with the right people. Be it a Bernie Sanders, who would have won the Democratic primary, be it votes in the long run for Jill Stein or other individuals. But again, what we know is that the results in the November election is Donald Trump was not freely and fairly elected president, and his vote count would have triggered investigations by our government, and we wouldn't have recognized them had they occurred outside the United States. What they want you to believe, in closing, they want you to believe that the universal laws of statistics apply everywhere in the universe except the territory of the United States. That which the CIA did covertly in the Third World during the Cold War, they now do overtly in the United States. We're socialized not to question the official vote count. And a little of my background, I talked about having sued in Ohio. 14 counties buy state-of-the-art ES&S OptiScans with audit logs and ballot images. So what happens in that circumstance? Well, they turn off their security, right? The security, the making copies of the actual ballot in case something happens. The audit logs, they turned them off. I sued. And here's the thing that people should keep in mind. I sued over the primaries. I sued because I was one of the people on the record that believed that Hillary Clinton and the DNC and contractors close to her were clearly ripping off the Sanders vote. And they were doing it because of through the use of computers. And that is done in a variety of ways. Thanks to the Russian allegations, we now recognize those ways. But again, these are private companies. Number one, you're allowing private companies to control your voter registration, your poll books, and very easy. There's a big shock in Durham. Some people showed up, and they weren't out of the voters' roll. That's the exact same problem that we complained about in Florida in 2000, right, with the extra people, same or similar names being deemed felons when they weren't. It's the same problem we experience to this day in Ohio, a swing state, right? In the run-up to the 2004 election, in Cleveland, they deregistered 24.96% of every single voter in the city of Cleveland, which voted 81% for John Kerry. So, well, how do they do that? Well, Debo, a company that's gone out of business after the courts determined they had a worldwide pattern of fraud. Right? They accidentally glitched 10,000 voters off the voting rolls. Now, with that in mind, and a lot of this, I updated this to make sure we had Donald Trump on it, the strip and flip disaster of America's stolen elections from the last election. And an earlier one happened in Ohio. But one thing I wanted to talk about was the question of what we learned from the presidential recount. For example, again, the U.S. State Department and the Agency on International Development use a red flag to determine possible fraudulent elections. And I think some of you may know this. Anybody know what the red flag they use is? The exit polls, sure. The most accurate polls in the world. Not the tracking polls, not the pre-election polls, but people are walking out and they're telling you how they voted. For example, you hear, well, they're not real accurate. Well, they are real accurate. They're just not real accurate in battleground states where it really matters. Did anybody look recently at the deviation in California? 0%. It's like, well, you know, Wisconsin's a very complex state. Oh yeah, more complex than California. Right? Well, the exit pollsters, the same one, got it within no margin of error. They directly were able to predict the vote count. Right? In 2004, 38 states that are overwhelming blue or red, they get it right. But in the battleground states, they get it wrong. And cumulatively, they get it wrong on the scales of once in every 750,000 election, you would get such strange results. So, as we think about what is happening, right? First in the primary, Hillary Clinton ended up with unexpected votes in the primary that the exit polls indicate she shouldn't have got. It was real clear since I flew into, I worked in Ohio and said, look, I know what's going to happen in this state. And it's not because I predict the future, but I do study the past, and I've seen it before. Right? In Bowling Green, in Athens, where Ohio University is, up on campus, students showed up to vote for Bernie, and shockingly, they weren't in the poll books. Oh my God, how could that happen? It's impossible. I'm glad no private, for-profit corporations that hate democratic socialists were privately controlling the voter registration databases. That's the only way that could happen. Oh, only the way we've designed our system could it happen under. Okay, so people were showing up, students in Athens County. You come into New York, right? I did go into New York and said, they're going to purge voters. And suddenly, a Bernie base, you're missing hundreds of thousands of registered voters in Brooklyn. Yeah. Should that be a shock? And then people are trying to vote in California. And what's happening? They're giving them the wrong ballot. I mean, no party preference. People are writing Bernie. It's not being recorded because the party regulars, under the control of the Secretary of State, is making it possible. Now, what you hear is, well, that's just the way politics is. Well, it's not. In the European Union, they register you to vote. It's a constitutional right. Here in the United States with these databases, I mean, how can we think of this as a constitutional right? When they're purging, in my state, they purged over 1 million people between the 2012 and 2016 election. They say, well, they deserve to be purged. They hadn't voted in the last 2 federal elections. There's a law in the books that says if you haven't voted in 2 federal election cycles, you can be deregistered. But that historically had meant 8 years. 1 election cycle, presidential, congressional. Another election cycle, presidential election. It's not, you didn't vote in the 2014 federal election for senator, and now you didn't vote in the primary, so you can't vote. I mean, how is it a constitutional right? If I don't go out and demonstrate in a 2-year period, I don't lose my First Amendment rights to speak. I mean, the bizarreness of not having, Judge Cho of Colorado, the chief election officer there, is going to have an automatic opt-in. I mean, we should immediately insist, right? If we had automatic opt-in like other democracies, Bernie Sanders would be president today. And Jill Stein, well, hopefully if we had other things like runoff votes that make it easy for third parties to vote, so you can actually vote for who you want as opposed to who you fear, often with good reason, is that, yeah, I mean, if we can get the variations in terms of, which I think you'll be addressing, the ways to get your, second preference being your actual second preference and your first preference.
Automatic opt-in?
Oh, well, automatic opt-in on registration. What
Opt-in.
opt-in is that they register you to vote and you have to tell them, no, I don't want to. So we can do that. Other factors that, if you think about, and again, I began to think about it because I was an international election observer in 1994 in El Salvador after the Civil War. And then in 1994, I was able to not only observe, but I co-wrote and edited the International Observers Report to the UN. And I met with the guerrillas, the FMLN. I met with the right-wing fascists. We tried to come up and discuss agreements on what would be fair. All they could think of was a large, clear box, transparent, and paper ballots where you would vote, put them in, open them up, and count them before the world. The TV cameras, the UN, the international observers, all the political parties. The exact opposite of the United States, where we have a black box run by private contractors. And you know, and I'm glad people are looking at the Russian issue, but why go after the Russians when you've given people keys to the kingdom and you have scientific evidence that your exit polls are wrong? That we know had these election results in the primary, in many states that went against Bernie, but in the general election, in 13 states, you had results that would have been deemed open for investigation as fraudulent. Remember, in 28 states, there was a shift to Bernie in 24, but in 12 of those states, the shift was so far outside the margin of error, our own government would not have seen them as legitimate without an investigation. That's what happened. There was actually one state, New York, where Hillary got a surprising amount of unexpected votes, but you could have given Trump all those votes and doubled it, she still would have won New York. But in key states, particularly Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida, the exit polls are saying that Clinton won. The final vote count is indicating elsewhere. And that's why Jill Stein, after it was turned down by Hillary Clinton, went in to look at those numbers, because the people exiting were telling us they voted significantly different than what the official vote count was in those areas. Briefly, what we learned from each of these states, in Wisconsin, they only counted about 49% of the vote. They didn't count the vote in Milwaukee. A state judge said, well, they have a right to look at the ballot, or they can just push the button and the numbers come out again. So that's what they did in Wisconsin. Also in Wisconsin, and we're still litigating this, it's still in litigation, the source is supposed to be held in escrow. So we argued we had a right to look at the source code in escrow and see if anyone, Russians, Seidel, ES&S, these American companies, although Seidel's from Spain, from Barcelona, and I'm trying to figure out how this mysterious company got to count the votes here in the US. So that's what happened in Wisconsin. They didn't comply with their own law. In Michigan, a totally different problem. You can't recount anything if somebody breaks the security seals. And it looks as when somebody found that out, somebody went around breaking the security seals. So we couldn't have a recount. And of course, the problem in Pennsylvania was obvious. You can't recount if there's no paper in your machines. If 85% or more don't have any paper, how are you going to recount? We argued we had a right to look at the machines to do forensic analysis of the computers. And they said, no, you don't. I mean, it's not like you're voting on these machines and they're paid for by taxpayers and they should be public records. No, these are sacred things that, only people that, you gotta be a shady, bizarre voting company with perhaps ties to the intelligence community, or you can't touch those machines. So, in that scenario, that's it. And so that's what happened to a large extent in the recount. We know we need paper and machines. We know we should vote on paper. We know there needs to be open source. There's already functioning technology, right? The Trachtenberg system in Humboldt County, right? Here's the proprietary. Right next to it, you have open source counting. So there's solutions to this. The rest of the world seems to get it right. And I believe we can get it right, and that way you end up with the right people. Be it a Bernie Sanders, who would have won the Democratic primary, be it votes in the long run for Jill Stein or other individuals. But again, what we know is that the results in the November election is Donald Trump was not freely and fairly elected president, and his vote count would have triggered investigations by our government, and we wouldn't have recognized them had they occurred outside the United States. What they want you to believe, in closing, they want you to believe that the universal laws of statistics apply everywhere in the universe except the territory of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.